For 45 years, two superpowers aimed thousands of nuclear weapons at each other, every single day. Two different worlds, two different ideologies, both convinced the other was an existential threat, both willing to destroy civilization to prove it. This is the Cold War, the conflict that never became a battle, but came terrifyingly close. To understand the Cold War, you have to start at the end of World War II. In 1945, the Allies had just defeated Nazi Germany together, but the alliance was already fracturing. The Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin had liberated Eastern Europe from the Nazis, and then it simply never left. One by one, Eastern European countries fell under Soviet control. An Iron Curtain, as Churchill called it, descended across the continent. Churchill stood at a podium in Missouri in 1946 and warned the world. From the Baltic to the Adriatic, he said, an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. The American response was the Truman Doctrine. The United States would support any nation resisting Soviet expansion, anywhere in the world. It was a blank check. That would define American foreign policy for decades. Europe was devastated. Cities were rubble. Economies were collapsed. The United States pumped $13 billion into rebuilding Western Europe under the Marshall Plan. The Soviets saw it as American imperialism. The West called it generosity. Both were partly right. Then in 1949, everything changed. The Soviet Union detonated its first nuclear bomb. America was no longer the only nuclear power. The world had just become far more dangerous. The Cold War turned hot almost immediately. In 1950, Communist North Korea invaded South Korea. American forces rushed in. Chinese forces followed. 3 years of brutal war ended roughly where it began. The line between North and South barely moved. 5 million people were dead. In October 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite, a small metal ball, orbiting the Earth every 96 minutes, beeping. Americans could hear it on the radio. If the Soviets could put a satellite in space, they could put a nuclear warhead anywhere on Earth. The space race had begun. America scrambled to catch up. Early rockets exploded on the launch pad while the Soviets sent the first man into space. Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth in 1961 and became the most famous human alive. Kennedy stood before Congress and made a promise. Before the decade is out, he said, the United States would land a man on the moon and return him safely. It was an audacious bet, and it would cost more than the Manhattan Project. In October 1962, an American spy plane photographed something in Cuba that stopped the world cold: Soviet nuclear missile launch sites, being built 90 miles from Florida. Kennedy went on television and told the American people. He announced a naval blockade of Cuba. Any Soviet ship attempting to cross it would be stopped by force. Soviet ships were already heading toward that line. For 6 days, the world held its breath. Soviet ships approached the blockade line. Then, they stopped. Then, they turned around. Secretary of State Dean Rusk said, "We are eyeball to eyeball," and the other fellow just blinked. Behind the scenes, frantic negotiations had produced a deal. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba. Quietly, the Americans would remove their missiles from Turkey. Both sides claimed victory. The world had come closer to nuclear war than most people knew. The Cold War cast its shadow everywhere. In Vietnam, America spent 20 years and 58,000 lives trying to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. The war tore American society apart. Protests erupted across America. Trust in the government collapsed. In 1975, The last American helicopter lifted off the rooftop of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Vietnam had fallen. It was the first war America had ever lost. By the early 1970s, a period of cautious cooperation, called détente, offered a glimpse of peace. Nixon visited China. Arms reduction treaties were signed. American and Soviet spacecraft even docked in orbit and exchanged handshakes in space. Then the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979. America secretly armed and funded the Afghan resistance. The Soviets found themselves in their own Vietnam, a quagmire they could not win and could not leave. Ronald Reagan escalated the arms race to a level the Soviet economy could not match. He proposed a space-based missile defense system, called Star Wars, that the Soviets feared was real. Trying to keep up was bankrupting them. In 1985, a new Soviet leader emerged. Mikhail Gorbachev knew the system was failing. He introduced glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. He wanted to save the Soviet Union. Instead, he accidentally ended it. In November 1989, crowds gathered at the Berlin Wall. A miscommunication led a border guard to open a checkpoint. People walked through, then ran. Then thousands came with hammers. The wall, the most powerful symbol of the Cold War, came down in a single night. One by one, communist governments across Eastern Europe fell, and on December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned. The Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet Union, 69 years old, ceased to exist. The Cold War never became a hot one. The bombs were never dropped. But for 45 years, the entire world lived under the shadow of instant annihilation, every single day. The Cold War ended, but it left behind 13,000 nuclear weapons that still exist today. It left behind proxy conflicts that are still being fought, and it left behind a world order whose fault lines we are still living with. The Cold War was not just a chapter in a history book. It was 45 years of ordinary people living ordinary lives, one miscalculation away from the end of everything. And somehow, we made it through. If this video kept you watching to the end, subscribe to Echoes of the Past, new history every Tuesday and Friday. Leave a comment. What moment from the Cold War do you think came closest to nuclear war? The answer might surprise you.